White lawyer laughed at black woman's court speech. Then the judge changed everything. The rain had been falling since dawn, not in an aggressive, thunder-laden way that rattles windows and sends pedestrians running for shelter, but in a soft, persistent drizzle that seemed determined to wash the city in a veil of silver. From the tall, arched windows of the Franklin County Courthouse, one could see the blurred outlines of the government buildings across the street, their edges softened by the watery curtain. Inside, the air was thick with the muted shuffle of papers, the low hum of voices, and the faint scent of polished oak and old books, the kind of smell that whispered of decades of justice and injustice meted out in equal measure. Amara Jackson stood near the double doors at the far end of the hallway, her hands folded tightly around a slim leather folder that looked far too modest to hold anything of consequence. She wore a navy blue dress, conservative, tailored, but softened by the simple gold pendant resting just below her collarbone. Her hair was neatly pulled back, not because she cared much about the court's opinion of her, but because she knew she needed every strand of her focus unclouded. Across the hall, leaning with casual confidence against the doorframe that led into courtroom 3, stood Martin Keating, the defense attorney. His tailored charcoal suit looked as though it had been ironed by the hands of someone who understood the power of a perfectly pressed lapel, and his smile, the one that curled without warmth, was a weapon honed over years of cutting into the credibility of witnesses and opponents alike. He was known among his peers for a certain charm that had less to do with sincerity and more with a calculated performance of it. He caught sight of Amara and tilted his head, the smirk deepening. "You know," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the small gap between them, "you could have saved yourself a lot of time if you just agreed to the settlement. It would have been easier for you." Amara's gaze didn't waver. "Easier doesn't mean right, Mr. Keating," she replied, her tone even, each word measured. He chuckled. Not the kind of laughter that comes from genuine amusement, but the brittle, hollow kind that carries an undertone of dismissal. "Right," he said, as though tasting the word and finding it slightly absurd. "We'll see what the judge thinks after your little speech." The implication in his tone was unmistakable. "You're out of your depth." But Amara only shifted the folder in her hands and said nothing more, turning instead toward the bailiff who had just called the session to order. As she walked past Keating, she caught the faintest whiff of his cologne, expensive, sharp, and it struck her how much the man seemed to embody the world she was up against. Polished on the outside, yet built on a foundation of assumptions about who held the upper hand. Inside the courtroom, the benches were half filled with spectators. Some there for curiosity, others because their own hearings were scheduled later in the day. The judge's bench loomed at the far end, elevated and framed by the state seal, with its carved eagle looking down at all who entered. Judge Eleanor Whitford sat behind it, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair swept into an immaculate bun and eyes that seemed to read every unspoken thought in the room. Amara took her place at the plaintiff's table, setting her folder down carefully, as if it were fragile. Martin Keating sauntered to his own table, dropping his leather briefcase onto the polished surface with a casual thud, as though to announce the weight of his authority. The clerk began the formalities, reading out the case number, the names, the charges and counterclaims, but Amara hardly heard them. Her mind was on the words she had prepared, not the ones typed neatly in her folder, but the ones she had carried in her for weeks now, the ones that had been sharpened in the quiet hours of the night when the world outside was still. Judge Whitford's eyes settled on her. "Ms. Jackson, I understand you wish to address the court directly before we proceed with witness testimony." "Yes, Your Honor," Amara replied, her voice steady. Martin leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, and let out a soft laugh, audible enough for those in the front rows to catch. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, an audible punctuation mark that said, Go ahead, entertain us. Amara heard it. Everyone did. But she didn't turn toward him. Instead, she opened her folder, revealing a few neatly typed pages and a single photograph clipped to the top. She took a slow breath, aware that every second of her silence was drawing the room's focus tighter around her. When she began to speak, her words were not rushed. They moved with the deliberate weight of someone who understood that the most powerful arguments are not always shouted, but spoken in a way that leaves no room for doubt. She told the court of events not just as a sequence of facts, but as a living tapestry of decisions, consequences, and choices made in shadows. She spoke of contracts twisted to fit greed, of promises broken not with loud betrayals but with the quiet cruelty of loopholes exploited, of a small business nearly destroyed because someone with resources believed they could. And while she spoke, Martin Keating kept that faint, mocking smile, though now and then it flickered, almost imperceptibly. Judge Whitford listened without a single interruption. Her hands were folded on the bench, but her eyes, sharp and unblinking, seemed to grow more intent with each passing moment. When Amara finished, the silence in the room was not the kind that comes when words fail. It was the kind that comes when the air has shifted, when everyone present feels, though they cannot yet explain, that something in the trajectory of events has changed. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Keating," she said, her voice calm, "I think before we proceed any further, we'll need to address a matter I find rather pressing." And just like that, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, the smile on Martin Keating's face faltered, and Amara felt, though she did not yet know why, that the ground beneath the case was beginning to tilt. The sound of Judge Whitford's voice, firm yet measured, seemed to resonate through the entire courtroom, carrying a gravity that drew even the casual observers to the edge of their seats. Martin Keating shifted in his chair, and though the movement was subtle, it carried with it the faintest hint of discomfort, like a man realizing, for the first time, that his footing might not be as sure as he thought. The judge removed her reading glasses, setting them neatly on the bench, and regarded him with the kind of unflinching eye contact that experienced jurists wield like a scalpel. "Mr. Keating," she began, "you've built a reputation for being meticulous, prepared, and, if I may, confident to the point of certainty. Yet, as I've reviewed the preliminary filings and evidence submissions, I find myself curious about certain omissions." Keating's trademark half-smile returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your Honor, I assure you, everything relevant to this case is in the record. If there's anything missing, it's because it was immaterial to the matter at hand." Judge Whitford tilted her head slightly, almost as though she were studying an intriguing insect beneath glass. "Immaterial," she repeated, letting the word linger in the air for a moment too long. "That is an interesting choice of term, considering the plaintiff's opening statement just introduced facts and documentation that your filings failed to address, facts which, if proven true, suggest a pattern of deliberate concealment on the part of your client." Amara kept her gaze on the table in front of her, though she could feel the shift in the room like a warm current moving beneath the surface. Keating straightened slightly, his fingers tapping a muted rhythm against the arm of his chair. "With respect, Your Honor, the plaintiff's narrative is colorful. She's trying to frame the situation in emotional terms to distract from the actual contractual obligations." "I'll be happy to." The judge held up a single hand, and the words died in his throat. "Mr. Keating, if there's one thing I do not tolerate in my courtroom, it is condescension, toward opposing counsel, toward the witnesses, or toward the intelligence of this court. I have been hearing cases long enough to recognize when someone is attempting to wave away inconvenient truths under the guise of legal technicalities." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiff's sharp look. Keating's smile faded into something more neutral. the mask of a man deciding, mid-game, that perhaps it was time to reconsider his strategy. "Of course, Your Honor. I meant no disrespect." Judge Whitford's gaze shifted to Amara. "Ms. Jackson, I'd like you to submit that photograph and any supporting documentation you referenced into evidence immediately. We will recess for 15 minutes to allow the defense to review it, but I expect both sides to be prepared to address its contents without unnecessary delay." Amara rose, her movements deliberate but calm, and handed the folder to the clerk. As she did, she caught the faintest flicker in Keating's eyes. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that the smooth, controlled pace of the hearing had just been disrupted, and not in his favor. When the judge declared the recess, the courtroom buzzed to life, the low hum of whispered speculation filling the air. Keating was already leaning toward his paralegal, his voice low but urgent, his hand gesturing toward the folder like it contained a live wire. Amara stepped into the hallway, where the rain still streaked down the tall windows, blurring the city beyond. She found a quiet corner, away from the curious glances and the hushed conversations. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself to exhale fully. She had known, when she decided to speak from the heart rather than rely solely on procedural argument, that it was a gamble. Keating thrived on turning sterile legal language into a weapon, a safe battlefield for someone used to winning. But in shifting the terrain into something human, she'd introduced a variable he couldn't fully control: truth, unpolished and unyielding. She thought of the moment the judge's tone had changed, that subtle but unmistakable shift from routine formality to pointed inquiry. It had been like hearing the first creak of ice beneath a man's feet, just before it gives way. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She pulled it out to see a text from her friend and business partner. "Malik, saw the live stream. You've got him rattled. Just keep steady. This is your fight." She smiled faintly, typing back a short reply before slipping the phone away. As she turned back toward the courtroom, she caught sight of Keating down the hall, speaking animatedly to a man she recognized as his client. The man's expression was tight, his jaw set, his hands slicing the air in an impatient gesture. Keating was nodding, but his eyes darted toward Amara for the briefest of moments, as though gauging whether she had seen him under pressure. She had, and she intended to remember it. When they reconvened, the room settled quickly into silence. Keating's voice, when he rose to respond to the new evidence, carried less of its earlier amusement and more of a guarded caution. Yet even as he spoke, Amara could feel the momentum shifting, not in great sweeping movements, but in small, deliberate turns, like a river carving its way around stone. And in the center of it all, Judge Whitford watched them both with an expression that gave nothing away, except the faintest suggestion that she had already begun to see the ending before either of them had. The rain had slowed by the time the afternoon session began, but its lingering scent drifted in through the high windows, mingling with the warm, faintly dusty aroma of the courtroom. Outside, the city was shrugging off the damp morning, but inside, the air was taut, not with noise, but with the charged stillness that comes when everyone present senses a subtle change in the balance of power. Martin Keating rose from his seat with the calculated deliberation of a man determined to reclaim lost ground. His fingers smoothed the front of his jacket, his shoulders squared, and when he addressed the court, his tone was lighter, almost conversational. The practiced voice of someone who wanted the room to believe he was entirely unshaken. "Your Honor," he began, "while the photograph presented by Ms. Jackson is compelling in its own way, I believe the court will see it for what it is: a single snapshot removed from context, and therefore incapable of conveying the full picture of the situation. We must not mistake a moment for a narrative." He let the words hang for a moment, his gaze sweeping the benches as though collecting silent nods from an invisible jury. Then, with a faint smile, he continued, "My client's business dealings have been consistent, transparent, and entirely within the bounds of contractual law. Any suggestion to the contrary is not only inaccurate but—" "Mr. Keating," Judge Whitford's voice cut in, not sharply, but with a measured firmness that carried more weight than a shout. "You will have ample opportunity to explain your interpretation of events. But what concerns me at present is the date and contents of this document visible in the background of the photograph. A document, I might add, that was not disclosed during discovery." The words landed with a kind of quiet finality. Keating blinked once, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the defense table, and for just a fraction of a second, his expression betrayed something unguarded. "Your Honor," he said, recovering quickly, "it is entirely possible the document in question is unrelated to this case. I would need to confer with my client to—" "Mr. Keating," the judge interrupted again, "do not tell me what is possible. Tell me what is true. If you cannot answer that at this moment, then we will have to proceed under the assumption that its absence from your disclosure was not an oversight." Amara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but inside she could feel the quiet thrill of watching a carefully built facade begin to fracture. The photograph had been more than symbolic. It was a fragment of evidence that, if examined closely, could unravel the defense's carefully curated story. The judge turned to her. "Ms. Jackson, would you please explain to the court how this photograph came into your possession?" Amara rose, and her voice was steady, carrying neither triumph nor hesitation, but the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times. "Yes, Your Honor. This photograph was taken during a meeting between myself, the defendant, and 2 members of his executive team. The document you see there, the one on the table partially obscured by the coffee cup, is an internal memorandum detailing proposed cost-cutting measures. The measures included, among other things, the cancellation of services to my business despite a standing agreement, without notice, and without fulfilling the obligations outlined in our signed contract." She let the words breathe, then added, "I believe the absence of that memorandum from discovery is significant, because it directly contradicts the defense's assertion that the termination of services was both lawful and in good faith." A murmur rippled through the gallery again, this time harder to suppress. The judge glanced toward the bailiff, who restored order with a curt motion. Keating's jaw tightened, but his voice, when he spoke, was smooth again. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is drawing assumptions from what may well be a draft of an internal discussion, never implemented, and certainly not part of any binding arrangement. The fact that it was not submitted simply reflects its irrelevance to the dispute." The judge's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "And yet, Mr. Keating, you were aware of its existence." There was a pause, brief but noticeable. "I was made aware, yes." "Then you were under obligation to produce it," Judge Whitford replied, her tone leaving no space for interpretation. "This court does not take kindly to selective transparency." Keating's shoulders shifted, the smallest hint of strain passing through his posture. He opened his mouth to respond, but the judge raised a hand. "We will revisit this point after I have reviewed the memorandum in its entirety. For now, I suggest we proceed with the witness testimony Ms. Jackson has prepared. I am particularly interested to hear from her former employees, as their accounts may shed further light on the matter." As the first witness, a middle-aged woman named Karen Doyle, approached the stand, Amara felt a calm settle over her. It wasn't the adrenaline-fueled satisfaction of winning a skirmish. It was something quieter, heavier, and far more dangerous for the man across the room from her. The slow, steady accumulation of truth, each piece fitting into place like a stone in a wall. And in that moment, as the court clerk swore in the witness, Amara noticed Keating's gaze flick toward her again. Not mocking this time, but calculating, as though he had just realized that the story he thought he controlled was no longer entirely his to tell. The courtroom lights hummed softly, casting a warm but unforgiving glow over the witness stand. Karen Doyle adjusted her glasses and folded her hands in her lap, glancing briefly toward Amara before settling her gaze on Judge Whitford. She looked like someone who had not intended to be in a courtroom that week, maybe not even that year, but who had finally decided that silence was a heavier burden than speaking. Ms. Doyle, Amara began, her tone gentle but deliberate. Can you tell the court how long you worked for the defendant's company? Karen cleared her throat. Almost 12 years. I started in accounting, moved up to operations manager about 6 years ago. And during your time there, Amara continued, were you aware of a document, a memorandum, outlining proposed cost-cutting measures? Karen's lips pressed together for a moment. Yes, I not only saw it, I was in the meeting where it was finalized. A faint stir moved through the room like wind across tall grass. Martin Keating leaned forward slightly, his pen tapping rhythmically against his legal pad, as if waiting for his moment to slice through the testimony. Amara let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. Finalized. That's your word. Karen nodded. Yes, it wasn't a draft by the time the meeting ended. The cost-cutting plan was approved and certain accounts, including yours, were specifically targeted for termination, even though fulfilling them would have been cheaper than the penalties for breaking the contracts. Judge Whitford's eyes sharpened. Do you have any insight as to why those accounts were chosen? Karen hesitated, glancing briefly at the defense table, then back to the judge. The accounts chosen were smaller businesses, ones less likely to have the resources to fight back in court. The thinking was that it would be faster and less costly to pay them off if they complained, rather than keeping the contracts going. Keating was on his feet instantly. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation on my client's intent. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. The witness is speaking to the content and context of a meeting she attended. Continue, Ms. Doyle. Karen's voice grew steadier. It wasn't speculation at the time. It was said outright in that meeting. Amara could feel the weight of the words settling into the room like stones. She let them rest there for a moment before moving on. And did you at any point share this information with the plaintiff prior to this case? No, Karen said firmly. Not until she contacted me after the termination. Even then, I was hesitant, but seeing how this has gone, I knew I had to speak. Amara gave a small nod of gratitude, then turned to the judge. Your Honor, I move to admit Ms. Doyle's testimony into the record in connection with Exhibit C, the photograph, as corroboration of the document's existence and intent. Granted, Judge Whitford replied without hesitation. Keating rose again, but this time his tone carried a brittle edge beneath its smooth surface. Ms. Doyle, you left the company under less than amicable circumstances. Isn't that correct? Karen met his gaze with a steadiness that surprised even Amara. If you mean I resigned after being asked to manipulate financial reports to make those terminations look justified, then yes, that's correct. The impact was immediate. Even those in the gallery who had been leaning back in casual observation now sat forward, their attention riveted. Keating's pen stopped tapping. He adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable, then said, "No further questions." When Karen stepped down from the stand, Amara could sense a shift not just in the legal footing of the case, but in the atmosphere between her and Keating. The smirk he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by something harder to define. Not fear exactly, but the realization that this was no longer the carefully choreographed dance he had planned. The next witness was Malik, Amara's business partner, whose testimony was expected to be more procedural. Invoices, correspondence, contractual timelines, but as he spoke, the pieces began to interlock with Karen's account in a way that was impossible to ignore. Every missed payment, every ambiguous letter, every strategically timed technical difficulty began to look less like coincidence and more like the steps of a deliberate strategy. Keating cross-examined him, but the questions felt thinner now, more like attempts to preserve a structure that was already leaning too far to one side. By the time Malik stepped down, the courtroom seemed to have subtly changed temperature. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter, as though sensing that something larger was unfolding. Judge Whitford called for a short recess. As the spectators filtered into the hallway, Keating stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, one hand resting lightly on the closed leather briefcase that had seemed so imposing earlier in the day. Amara, gathering her notes, caught a brief reflection in the polished wood. His profile still composed, but with just enough tension in the jaw to tell her that for the first time in years, he might be facing a case he couldn't simply outmaneuver. And she knew, without yet knowing how, that the real turning point was still to come. When the recess ended, the room seemed to hold its breath. The spectators had filed back in with a kind of restless anticipation, their earlier murmurs replaced by the quiet scrape of shoes on the polished floor and the faint shuffle of papers. Even the air felt different, less like the procedural calm of a scheduled hearing and more like the charged stillness before a verdict. Judge Eleanor Whitford took her seat, her silver hair immaculate, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. She glanced down at her notes, then looked directly at the defense table. "Mr. Keating," she began, her voice even but carrying the weight of the bench. "Before we proceed, I must address an issue that has become impossible to ignore." Keating straightened, hands folded neatly on the table. "Your Honor, if this is about the memorandum—" "It is," she interrupted. "And more." She removed her glasses, setting them down with deliberate care. This court was prepared to hear a standard contractual dispute. What I have heard instead is evidence of a calculated pattern of targeting certain clients, smaller businesses, many owned by individuals from marginalized communities, for termination, under the presumption that they would lack the resources to fight back. The words seemed to reverberate in the chamber. Keating's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. His client shifted uncomfortably beside him, his gaze locked on the tabletop. "This," the judge continued, "is not merely a matter of contract law. It is a matter of fairness, of equal treatment under the law, and of whether this court will allow business practices that exploit the assumption of who is and who is not likely to win in a courtroom." Amara felt a knot in her chest loosen, though she kept her expression calm. Judge Whitford turned to her. "Ms. Jackson, you have shown patience and precision in presenting your case. The court commends your restraint in the face of unnecessary dismissiveness from opposing counsel earlier today." Keating's gaze flickered toward her, but the smirk was gone entirely now. The judge continued, "I find that the defendant's failure to disclose the memorandum, coupled with the corroborating testimony we have heard, constitutes willful concealment of material evidence. I will be referring this matter to the State Bar for review. Furthermore, I am granting judgment in favor of the plaintiff for the full amount sought, with additional damages for breach of good faith and fair dealing." For a heartbeat, the courtroom was utterly still. Then the words began to sink in. Keating shifted in his seat, his carefully maintained composure thinning. His client leaned in, speaking in a harsh whisper, but the judge's voice cut cleanly over them. "This case will serve as a reminder, both to this court and to those who practice before it, that the law is not a tool to be used against the vulnerable. It is a shield meant to protect them. Amara sat back, feeling the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about the money or even the victory. It was about the recognition that what had happened to her was wrong, and that someone with the authority to make it matter had said so in the full light of the record. When the gavel came down, it was not with violence, but with a steady, final certainty. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. The city was washed clean, sunlight breaking through the clouds, gilding the courthouse steps as Amara emerged. She could feel eyes on her, strangers, reporters, even a few who had been silent in the gallery. But she kept walking, Malik at her side, the leather folder still in her hand. Behind her, Martin Keating exited moments later, his stride brisk, his eyes fixed ahead. The man who had laughed that morning now wore the expression of someone who had been reminded, in the clearest possible terms, that arrogance has limits. And somewhere deep down, Amara knew this wasn't just her win. It was a warning,